In a sun-bleached Nevada strip mall, a lanky 16-year-old was about to face his first martial arts lesson. A routine trial class turned explosive when Sensei Ethan Rourke, renowned for his tournament victories and harsh discipline, delivered a humiliating slap across Lucas Hayes' face for claiming his grandfather trained Navy SEALs. Lucas Hayes wasn't your typical awkward teenager. For decades, he'd carried the quiet legacy of Sergeant Major William Hayes, legendary Special Forces hand-to-hand combat instructor whose teachings shaped elite warriors behind closed doors. One of those warriors was Steven Seagal. When Rourke struck Lucas and dismissed his grandfather's service as bedtime stories, he had no idea he was about to face a reckoning. Lucas made no calls for revenge, but fate would bring validation in the form of an unexpected visitor who would trigger a complete transformation of everything the dojo claimed to represent. What began as a teenager's public humiliation would become a historic dismantling of ego-driven martial arts. The Iron Spirit Dojo would never be the same after Steven Seagal walked through those doors and revealed the truth about a quiet man who had trained legends to be something more than fighters. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the Sunset Ridge strip mall, its heat waves rising like ghostly spirits from the baking pavement. Lucas Hayes sat on a weathered concrete bench outside Iron Spirit Martial Arts, his fingers absently stroking the graying muzzle of his loyal companion, Jasper. The old mutt's tongue lolled out, panting softly as he gazed up at his 16-year-old master with tired but devoted eyes. Lucas clutched a small worn compass in his free hand, its brass surface smooth from decades of handling. His grandfather had given it to him years ago, along with stories that seemed too incredible to be true. Stories of quiet men who moved like shadows, who could end conflicts before they began, who valued wisdom over winning. The compass needle pointed steadily north, just as Grandpa William had taught him. True north never changes, boy. People might try to spin you around, but if you know where north is, you'll never be lost. Through the glass doors of the dojo, Lucas could see figures moving in precise formations, their white uniforms crisp under the fluorescent lights. The sound of barked commands and synchronized movements filtered through the walls, creating an atmosphere of discipline and intensity that made his stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. "You sure about this, Jasper?" Lucas whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Jasper responded with a gentle whine and a reassuring nuzzle against Lucas's leg. The boy had been putting off this trial lesson for weeks, ever since his mother had suggested martial arts might help him gain confidence. Angela Hayes had noticed her son's tendency to fade into the background, to let others speak while he listened from the shadows. The front door chimed as it swung open, and a girl about his age emerged, her black belt tied perfectly around her waist. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Her dark hair was pulled back in a flawless ponytail, and her eyes held the sharp focus of a predator sizing up potential prey. "You must be the new trial student," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "I'm Maya Lee, head student here. You picked a good dojo. Sensei Rourke is one of the best instructors in the state. Won 3 regional championships in his competitive days." Lucas stood slowly, Jasper rising with him. "I'm Lucas Hayes. This is Jasper. He'll wait outside." Maya's eyes flicked to the aging mutt, and her expression softened slightly. "He's sweet. Just make sure he stays in the shade. It's brutal out here today." She held the door open for him. "Come on, I'll introduce you to Mr. Ito. He handles the paperwork and new student orientation." The cool air conditioning hit Lucas like a physical force as he stepped inside. The dojo was larger than it appeared from outside, with polished wooden floors that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Mirrors covered 3 walls, reflecting the movements of a dozen students practicing forms in perfect synchronization. Trophies lined shelves along the back wall, their golden surfaces catching the light like miniature suns. An older Japanese man approached from behind a small desk in the corner, his movements graceful despite his age. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held a warmth that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the training session. "Welcome to Iron Spirit," he said, offering a slight bow. "I am Mr. Kenji Ito, assistant instructor. You have a loyal friend out there." He gestured toward the window where Jasper had found a shady spot and was settling down for a nap. "He's been with our family for years," Lucas replied, accepting a clipboard with forms to fill out. "My grandfather rescued him as a puppy." Mr. Ito's eyes lingered on Lucas's face for a moment, as if seeing something that reminded him of someone else. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. Dogs are excellent judges of character. They see beyond what we choose to show the world." Before Lucas could respond, the training session came to an abrupt halt. Every student snapped to attention, their eyes focused on a doorway at the back of the dojo. The silence was so complete that Lucas could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the strip mall parking lot. Sensei Ethan Rourke entered like a force of nature, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. At 38, he possessed the kind of lean, muscular build that spoke of years of dedicated training. His black belt was worn at the edges, a testament to countless hours of practice, and his movements carried the fluid precision of someone who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome. "Students," his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We have a visitor today, someone who's considering joining our Iron Spirit family." His eyes found Lucas, and the intensity of that gaze made the boy's heart race. "What's your name?" "Son." "Lucas Hayes, sir." "Well, Lucas Hayes, you're about to witness something special." Maya, front and center. "Show our guest what 3 years of proper training can accomplish." Maya stepped forward without hesitation, dropping into a perfect fighting stance. Her movements were a blur of controlled power as she executed a complex series of kicks and blocks, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next. The other students watched with reverent attention, and Lucas found himself genuinely impressed by her skill and dedication. "Excellent," Rourke said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "This is what discipline looks like, Lucas. This is what happens when you commit yourself completely to the art. No shortcuts, no excuses, no room for weakness." As Maya returned to her position, Lucas felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. The compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit, boy. It's about how much you can take and keep moving forward." "Mr. Ito," Rourke continued, "get Lucas suited up. Let's see what he's made of." The training uniform felt foreign against Lucas's skin, the stiff cotton fabric rustling with each movement, as he tried to find his place among the other students. The white GI was borrowed from the dojo's supply, and it hung loosely on his lanky frame, making him feel even more out of place among the perfectly uniformed practitioners around him. "Basic stance," Rourke commanded, and the class moved in unison, dropping into identical positions. Lucas attempted to mirror their movements, but his legs felt awkward and uncertain. His grandfather's compass pressed against his hip through the uniform, a small comfort in the sea of synchronized perfection surrounding him. Maya, positioned to his right, shot him a sideways glance. "Feet wider," she whispered. "Weight evenly distributed." There was no mockery in her voice, just the automatic correction of someone accustomed to excellence. The class progressed through basic techniques, each movement accompanied by sharp exhales and the slap of bare feet against the polished floor. Lucas found himself a half-beat behind, his body struggling to translate the visual cues into proper form. Mr. Ito moved quietly through the ranks, offering gentle corrections with soft-spoken words and subtle adjustments. "Remember," Rourke's voice echoed off the mirrored walls. "In competition, there's no room for hesitation. Every movement must be precise, powerful, and committed. Half-hearted techniques are losing techniques." As the class neared its end, Rourke called the students to attention. "Before we close, I want to demonstrate something that perfectly embodies the Iron Spirit philosophy." He moved to the center of the mat, his posture radiating confidence. "Maya, attack sequence 3. Maya stepped forward, her body coiling like a spring. She launched into a series of attacks that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Rourke deflected each strike with minimal effort, his movements flowing like water around stone. Then, with theatrical flair, he spun into a devastating roundhouse kick that stopped just inches from Maya's head. The watching parents applauded, their faces beaming with approval. Lucas found himself impressed despite his growing unease with the dojo's emphasis on showmanship over substance. That, Rourke announced, is what 10 years of dedicated training looks like. Power, precision, and complete control. He gestured to the trophy cases. These awards didn't earn themselves. They're the result of unwavering commitment to excellence. As the class began to disperse, Lucas lingered near the edge of the mat, uncertainty gnawing at him. The techniques were impressive, but something felt hollow about the whole experience. His grandfather's stories had always emphasized different values: humility, service, the importance of avoiding conflict rather than seeking it. So what did you think? Maya asked, toweling sweat from her forehead. Pretty intense, right? Sensei Rourke doesn't mess around. Lucas nodded slowly. It's definitely impressive. Those kicks were incredible. 3 years of training, Maya said with pride. I've placed in every tournament I've entered this year. Sensei says I might be ready for black belt testing by next summer. A group of parents had gathered around Rourke, their voices filled with admiration as they discussed their children's progress. Lucas could hear fragments of conversation about upcoming tournaments and ranking tests. The atmosphere was charged with competitive energy, everyone focused on the next achievement, the next level to conquer. That spinning kick was something else, one father said, his voice carrying across the dojo. I've never seen anything like it. Lucas felt the words rising in his throat before he could stop them. That's not how real fighters move. The conversation died instantly. Every eye in the room turned to him, and Lucas felt heat flooding his cheeks. The compass in his pocket seemed to pulse with his racing heartbeat. Excuse me. Rourke's voice was deceptively quiet, but Lucas could hear the edge beneath the surface calm. I just meant. Lucas swallowed hard, knowing he should back down, but unable to stop himself. My grandfather always said that real combat isn't about flashy moves. He trained Navy SEALs, and he used to tell me that in actual fights, you want to end things quickly and simply. No wasted motion. A ripple of whispers spread through the assembled parents. Maya's eyes widened, and Lucas caught Mr. Ito's sharp intake of breath from across the room. Your grandfather trained Navy SEALs. Rourke's tone had shifted, carrying a note of amused skepticism. That's quite a claim, young man. Sergeant Major William Hayes, Lucas said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke his grandfather's name. He was a hand-to-hand combat instructor for Special Forces units. He didn't like to talk about it much, but he taught me some things about real fighting. The room erupted in barely contained laughter. Lucas felt the sound like physical blows, each chuckle and snort driving him deeper into humiliation. Even some of the students were smirking, their respect for his grandfather's legacy crumbling under the weight of public mockery. I'm sure your grandfather was a very interesting man, Rourke said, his voice dripping with condescension. But I think you might be confusing war stories with reality. Real combat training requires documentation, certification, a verifiable record of service. He didn't keep certificates, Lucas protested, his voice growing desperate. He said that kind of recognition wasn't important. He just wanted to teach people how to protect themselves and others. How convenient. Rourke's smile was razor-sharp. No proof, no witnesses, just bedtime stories from Grandpa. He stepped closer, his presence looming over Lucas like a thundercloud. Let me tell you something about real martial arts, son. It's not about fantasy or wishful thinking. It's about discipline, respect, and knowing your place. Before Lucas could react, Rourke's hand shot out, delivering a sharp slap across his left cheek. The sound echoed through the dojo like a gunshot, and the room fell into stunned silence. Lucas staggered backward, his hand flying to his burning cheek, tears welling in his eyes. That, Rourke said, his voice cold and final, is what happens when you disrespect your instructor and fabricate stories to make yourself feel important. Lucas stood frozen, the taste of blood on his lip where his teeth had cut the soft flesh. The compass in his pocket felt like a lead weight, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away, boy. There's no shame in refusing to fight on someone else's terms. Without a word, Lucas turned and walked toward the exit, his bare feet silent on the polished floor. Behind him, he could hear the resumed conversations, the nervous laughter, the way the room was already moving on from his humiliation. Maya started to follow, but Mr. Ito's gentle hand on her shoulder stopped her. The Nevada heat hit him like a physical blow as he pushed through the glass doors. Jasper was instantly alert, his tail wagging until he saw the tears on Lucas's face. The old dog whined softly, pressing his warm body against his young master's legs. "Come on, boy," Lucas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." The concrete curb outside the dojo felt like sandpaper against Lucas's legs as he sat with Jasper's head in his lap, the dog's warm weight a small comfort against the burning shame that threatened to consume him. The strip mall parking lot stretched before them, a sea of heat-shimmered asphalt dotted with cars whose metal surfaces radiated waves of desert warmth. His phone felt heavy in his trembling hands as he scrolled to his mother's number. Each ring seemed to echo in his chest, and when Angela Hayes' voice came through the speaker, warm and concerned, Lucas nearly broke down completely. "Mom," his voice cracked like a 13-year-old's. "Can you come pick me up, please?" "Lucas? What's wrong? You sound upset." I need to come home. I'm at the dojo, but I don't want to be here anymore." "I'll be right there. Sweetheart. 10 minutes. Angela's beat-up Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot exactly 10 minutes later, its engine rattling with the particular sound of a vehicle that had seen better decades. She emerged wearing her work uniform from the diner, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, worry lines creasing her forehead as she took in her son's dejected posture. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside him on the hot pavement. Jasper immediately shifted his attention to her, seeking additional comfort to offer his pack. Lucas tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a rush of embarrassment and anger. He told her about the demonstration, about his stupid comment, about mentioning Grandpa William. When he got to the part about the slap, Angela's face went rigid with barely contained fury. "He hit you." Her voice was dangerously quiet. "It wasn't that hard," Lucas said quickly, though the left side of his face still throbbed. I made him look bad in front of everyone. I shouldn't have said anything about Grandpa." Angela was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on Jasper's head as she stared at the dojo's windows. "Get in the car," she said finally. "We need to go home and talk." The drive through sun-bleached Nevada suburbs passed in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Angela's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Lucas could see the muscle in her jaw working as she processed what had happened to her son. Their small ranch house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its stucco walls painted a faded yellow that had once been cheerful but now looked tired in the harsh desert light. The front yard was mostly gravel and desert plants, practical choices for a single mother working double shifts to make ends meet. "Sit," Angela said once they were inside, gesturing to the worn couch in their small living room. "I need to get something." She disappeared into her bedroom, and Lucas could hear her moving boxes around in her closet. Jasper settled at his feet, the old dog's breathing steady and comforting in the air-conditioned quiet of the house. When Angela returned, she was carrying a cardboard box that looked like it had been sealed for years. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window as she set it on the coffee table with trembling hands. "I should have shown you this years ago," she said, her voice thick with emotion. After he died, it was too painful to look at." "But what happened today?" She shook her head. "Your grandfather was the most humble man I ever knew. He never talked about his service, never bragged about what he'd done. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen." Lucas watched in fascination as she opened the box, revealing a collection of faded photographs, official documents, and a small leather journal. The smell of old paper and memories wafted up, and he felt his grandfather's presence as clearly as if the old man were sitting beside him. "Look at this," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper. She handed him a black and white photograph showing a group of young men in military fatigues. They were gathered around an older man who looked remarkably like an aged version of Lucas himself, the same lanky build, the same thoughtful eyes, the same way of standing slightly apart from the crowd. "That's him," she said, pointing to the older man. "This was taken at some kind of training facility. I found it in his things after the funeral, along with letters from people thanking him for his instruction." Lucas studied the photograph, his hands shaking slightly. The young men surrounding his grandfather had the lean, hard look of elite soldiers, but their expressions showed genuine respect and affection for their instructor. "There's more," Angela said, lifting out a collection of documents. Military, commendations, training certificates, letters of recommendation from commanding officers whose names had been redacted. He was the real deal, Lucas. He just never felt the need to prove it to anyone. The leather journal was the last item she removed from the box, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Lucas recognized it immediately. He'd seen his grandfather writing in it during quiet evenings, his pen moving carefully across the pages in neat, precise handwriting. "Read this," Angela said, opening to a page marked with a faded ribbon. This is what he believed about fighting. Lucas's eyes moved across the familiar handwriting, his grandfather's voice seeming to speak directly from the page. "True strength is not measured by the force of your strike, but by your willingness to avoid striking at all. Any fool can learn to hurt another person. It takes wisdom to know when not to. The most dangerous fighters are those who have nothing to prove, because they fight only when all other options have been exhausted. Pride is the enemy of survival, and ego is the enemy of wisdom." Tears blurred Lucas's vision as he continued reading. "I've trained men who went on to become legends in their field, but the ones I'm most proud of are those who came home and never had to use what I taught them. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first response. A true martial artist bows deeper than he kicks, speaks softer than he shouts, and walks away more often than he engages. He wrote this about you," Angela said, turning to another page. "When you were just a baby. My grandson has the gift of seeing people's hearts. He notices things others miss, feels pain that isn't his own. This sensitivity might seem like weakness to some, but I believe it's the foundation of true strength. The world needs protectors who fight not from anger or pride, but from love and necessity. I pray he never has to use the skills I might teach him, but if he does, I hope he'll remember that the greatest victories are won without throwing a single punch." Lucas closed the journal with shaking hands, his grandfather's words settling into his heart like seeds finding fertile ground. He really was everything he said he was, wasn't he? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And more," Angela said, wiping tears from her eyes. He could have filled a wall with certificates and awards, but he chose to keep his service quiet. That's the kind of man he was, more interested in who he was than what people thought of him. Jasper whined softly, sensing the emotional weight of the moment. Lucas reached down to scratch behind his ears, and the old dog's tail thumped against the floor. "What do I do now?" Lucas asked. "I can't go back there." "Not after." "You can go back," Angela said firmly. "Not to that instructor, but to honor what your grandfather stood for. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Lucas. You just have to be true to who you are and what you believe." She gathered the photographs and documents back into the box, but left the journal on the coffee table. "This belongs to you now. Your grandfather would want you to have it, to learn from it, to carry his wisdom forward." As the sun began to set outside their window, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink, Lucas felt something shifting inside him. The shame was still there. The memory of that slap still burned, but underneath it all was a growing sense of purpose. His grandfather's legacy wasn't about proving himself to men like Sensei Rourke. It was about carrying forward a different kind of strength, a different way of being in the world. "I think I know what I need to do," he said quietly. Angela smiled through her tears. "What's that?" "I need to go back tomorrow. Not to fight, not to prove anything, but to stand up for what Grandpa taught me. Even if nobody believes me, even if they laugh again, I need to honor his memory." "Your grandfather would be proud," Angela said, pulling him into a fierce hug. "But remember what he wrote. The greatest victories are won without throwing a single punch." Outside, the desert night was settling over the city, and somewhere across town, a dojo full of trophies and certificates stood empty, waiting for tomorrow's lessons. But here in this modest living room, with a faded journal and a loyal dog and a mother's love, Lucas Hayes was learning the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes not from what others think of you, but from what you know to be true in your heart. The next evening's class at Iron Spirit Martial Arts proceeded with the same rigid precision that had become Sensei Rourke's trademark. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glow across the polished floors where 23 students moved in perfect synchronization. Parents lined the back wall, their phones out to capture videos of their children's forms, the occasional flash of a camera adding to the theatrical atmosphere. Maya Lee stood at the front of the class, her black belt crisp around her waist as she demonstrated the advanced kata that had taken her 3 years to master. Her movements were flawless, each technique flowing into the next with the precision of a machine calibrated for competition. The watching parents murmured their approval, and Rourke nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent, Maya. That's exactly the kind of dedication that wins tournaments," he announced, his voice carrying across the dojo. "Remember, everyone, perfection is not an accident. It's the result of countless hours of practice, unwavering focus, and the willingness to push beyond your comfort zone." Mr. Ito stood quietly in the corner, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed the class. Something had been bothering him since the incident with Lucas Hayes the previous day. The boy's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had stirred memories of his own early training in Japan, where his sensei had taught him that true strength revealed itself in moments of adversity, not triumph. The front door chimed, and everyone turned to see who had entered. A man in his early 70s stepped through the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his unremarkable appearance. He wore simple dark clothing, black jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and comfortable walking shoes. His silver hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and his eyes held the calm steadiness of someone who had seen much and judged little. A ripple of recognition spread through the room like wildfire. Parents began whispering to each other. Phones came out for quick Google searches, and even the students broke their rigid attention to steal glances at the newcomer. "Is that really?" one mother whispered to her husband. "It has to be," he replied, his voice filled with awe. "Steven Seagal. What's he doing here?" Rourke's expression shifted from surprise to barely contained excitement. This was the kind of opportunity that could elevate his dojo's reputation beyond his wildest dreams. A visit from a legitimate martial arts celebrity, someone whose name carried weight in the community. It was like winning the lottery. "Mr. Seagal," Rourke said, stepping forward with his most charming smile. "What an incredible honor. I'm Sensei Ethan Rourke, owner and head instructor of Iron Spirit Martial Arts. To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" Seagal's eyes swept the room, taking in the trophy cases, the uniformed students, the eager faces of the parents. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily through the space. "I was in the area on business," he said simply. "Heard there was a traditional dojo here. Mind if I observe?" "Of course. Please, make yourself comfortable." Rourke gestured to the bench along the wall, the same spot where Lucas had been humiliated just 24 hours earlier. "We were just working on advanced forms. These students represent the best of what modern martial arts training can achieve." Seagal nodded politely and took a seat, his movements graceful despite his age. Mr. Ito approached and offered a deep bow, which Seagal returned with equal respect. "Ito-san," Seagal said, recognizing the traditional formality. "It's good to see proper etiquette still being observed." Mr. Ito's face brightened. "You honor us with your presence, Seagal-san. Your films inspired many of us to pursue the martial arts." "Class, attention," Rourke called out, his voice carrying a note of barely contained triumph. "We have a very special guest today. I'm sure you all recognize Mr. Steven Seagal, one of the most respected martial artists in the world." Maya's eyes went wide, and several of the younger students began whispering excitedly among themselves. The parents were now openly recording, their phones capturing every moment of this unexpected encounter. "Mr. Seagal," Rourke continued, "perhaps you'd like to see what our advanced students can do? Maya here has been training with us for 3 years and has placed in every tournament she's entered." Seagal's gaze settled on Maya with gentle interest. "Show me what you've learned, young lady." Maya stepped forward, her nervousness evident despite her attempts to maintain composure. She began the same kata she'd been demonstrating earlier, but now every movement felt magnified under Seagal's quiet observation. Her techniques were still flawless, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a slight rushing of her breathing that spoke to the pressure she felt. When she finished, Seagal nodded approvingly. "Very clean technique. You've clearly put in many hours of practice." Thank you, sir, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Seagal, Rourke said, sensing an opportunity, I'd be honored if you'd share some of your philosophy with my students. They could learn so much from someone with your experience. Seagal was quiet for a moment, his eyes continuing to survey the room. They lingered on the trophy cases, moved across the formal photographs of Rourke's tournament victories, and finally settled on a small memorial photo tucked almost out of sight behind a larger award. I once knew a man, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. A man who taught me everything worth knowing about the martial arts. Not the flashy stuff, not the tournament techniques, but the real principles that make a warrior. The room was completely silent now. Even the parents had stopped their whispering. His name was William Hayes, Seagal continued, and Mr. Ito's sharp intake of breath was audible across the dojo. Sergeant Major William Hayes, though he never used his rank outside of official business. He was a hand-to-hand combat instructor for Special Forces units, back when that kind of training was still classified. Rourke's face had gone pale, and several parents exchanged confused glances. The name was familiar to some of them. Hadn't a boy mentioned that same name just yesterday? Master Hayes taught me that the most important technique in any martial art is knowing when not to use it, Seagal said, his voice growing quieter, forcing everyone to strain to hear. He believed that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to protect them. He used to say that any fool can learn to hurt someone. It takes a warrior to know when to walk away. At that moment, the front door opened again, and Lucas Hayes stepped inside with his grandfather's journal clutched in his hands. Jasper waited outside in the shade, his tail wagging as he watched his young master through the glass. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more devastating. Lucas had come to honor his grandfather's memory, to stand up for what he believed in regardless of the consequences. Instead, he found himself walking into a scene that would validate everything he'd tried to tell them the day before. Seagal's eyes found Lucas immediately, and something in his expression shifted. The older man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and respectful. "You must be William's grandson," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence of the dojo. "You have his eyes, his way of standing. He talked about you often during our training sessions." Lucas felt the world tilt around him. Every eye in the room was fixed on him, but this time there was no mockery, no dismissive laughter. Instead, there was a growing awareness that something significant was happening, something that would change everything they thought they knew about strength, respect, and the true meaning of martial arts. "You knew my grandfather?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Seagal nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "William Hayes made me the man I am today. Every principle I live by, every technique that matters, every moment of wisdom I've found in the martial arts, it all traces back to him." The journal in Lucas's hands seemed to pulse with warmth, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice echoing through the years. "The greatest victories are won without throwing a single punch." In that moment, with Steven Seagal's words hanging in the air like a challenge to everything the dojo claimed to represent, Lucas Hayes realized that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a person's arsenal is simply the truth, spoken quietly and without fear. The real lesson was about to begin. The silence in the dojo stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of Seagal's words. Lucas stood frozen in the doorway, his grandfather's journal pressed against his chest like a shield, while 23 pairs of eyes shifted between him and the legendary martial artist who had just validated everything he'd claimed the day before. Sensei Rourke's face had gone through a spectrum of colors, from pale shock to flushed embarrassment to something approaching panic. The parents who had laughed at Lucas's fantasies now found themselves frantically trying to process the impossible reality unfolding before them. "Tell me about William," Seagal said, his voice cutting through the tension as he walked slowly toward Lucas. "Is he still with us?" Lucas shook his head, his throat tight with emotion. "He passed away 2 years ago. Cancer." "I'm sorry for your loss," Seagal said, and the genuine grief in his voice was unmistakable. "He was one of the finest men I've ever known. A teacher in the truest sense of the word." Maya Lee stood transfixed, her competitive confidence cracking as she watched this quiet exchange. The boy she'd dismissed as awkward and unprepared was somehow connected to a legend, and the realization was reshaping everything she thought she knew about strength and importance. Mr. Seagal, Rourke interjected, his voice strained as he fought to regain control of the situation. Perhaps there's been some confusion. The boy mentioned his grandfather yesterday, but without any documentation or proof. William never needed proof, Seagal interrupted, his tone remaining calm but carrying an edge that made Rourke step back. He was the kind of man who let his actions speak for themselves, the kind who taught warriors not to be warriors, but to be something better. He gestured to the journal in Lucas's hands. Is that his? Lucas nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Mom found it yesterday, along with some other things. Photos, letters, commendations. May I? With trembling hands, Lucas opened the leather-bound journal to a page he'd memorized the night before. Seagal's eyes moved across the familiar handwriting, and a smile of recognition spread across his weathered features. The most dangerous opponent is the one who has nothing to prove, he read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of memory. He wrote that after our third training session. I was young, arrogant, convinced that my natural ability made me invincible. William spent an entire afternoon teaching me humility. The journal pages rustled as Seagal carefully turned them, his expression growing more reverent with each familiar phrase. Here, he said, pointing to a passage that made Lucas's breath catch. S. Continues to improve, but his greatest asset is not his technique. It's his willingness to learn. Today he asked me not how to strike harder, but how to end conflicts without violence. This is the mark of a true warrior. You're in my grandfather's journal, Lucas said, wonder coloring his voice. He believed in keeping records of his students' progress, not for evaluation, but for understanding. He said that teaching was like planting seeds. You might not see the growth for years, but you had to tend the soil with patience and care. Seagal closed the journal carefully and handed it back to Lucas. Your grandfather taught me that the highest form of martial arts isn't about defeating enemies. It's about turning enemies into friends. He showed me that true strength comes from restraint, not release. Mr. Ito stepped forward, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Seagal-san, what you describe, this is the traditional way, the way many of us have forgotten in our pursuit of medals and recognition. William never forgot, Seagal replied. Every lesson he taught, every technique he demonstrated, every story he shared, it all came back to the same principle. The warrior's greatest victory is the fight he never has to fight. The students were listening with rapt attention now, their rigid formation forgotten as they absorbed words that challenged everything they'd been taught about martial arts. Some of the parents had lowered their phones, sensing that this was something too sacred to be captured on video. But how do we know any of this is true? Rourke said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. I mean, with all due respect, Mr. Seagal, stories can be embellished over time. Memory can play tricks. You want proof? Seagal asked, his voice taking on a different quality. William taught me something he called the ghost step, a way of moving that makes your opponent's attacks pass through empty air. He said it was something he developed during his time with Special Forces, refined through years of teaching men whose lives depended on coming home. Without warning, Seagal moved toward Rourke, his approach so fluid and natural that it seemed like a casual stroll. But as he drew closer, something in his posture shifted, and suddenly he wasn't just an elderly man in street clothes. He was something altogether more dangerous. Attack me, he said simply. Rourke hesitated, his instructor's ego warring with his survival instincts. Mr. Seagal, I don't think. William always said that the best way to understand a technique was to experience it firsthand. Attack me. The challenge hung in the air like a dare. Rourke glanced around the room, acutely aware that every eye was upon him. His reputation, his authority, his entire identity as a martial arts instructor was on the line. Very well, he said, dropping into his preferred fighting stance. But I want everyone to understand that this is purely educational. Seagal stood completely relaxed, his hands at his sides, his weight evenly distributed. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not someone about to face an attack from a trained martial artist. Rourke launched forward with a quick jab, the same technique he'd used to begin countless sparring sessions. But instead of connecting with his target, His fist passed through empty air as Seagal simply wasn't there anymore. The older man had moved maybe 6 inches to the left, but somehow, the attack had missed completely. Again, Seagal said, his voice unchanged. This time Rourke tried a combination, jab, cross, hook, putting real power behind his strikes. But each punch found only air, while Seagal seemed to drift around him like smoke, never hurrying, never showing strain, simply not being where the attacks were aimed. "I don't understand," Maya whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's not about speed," Seagal explained as he continued to evade Rourke's increasingly frantic attacks. "It's about understanding. William taught me to read intention, to see where an attack was going before it got there. He said that most fights are won in the mind before the first punch is thrown." Rourke stepped back, breathing hard, his perfect uniform now wrinkled and damp with sweat. "How is that possible?" "Practice," Seagal said simply. "And the right teacher. William spent months teaching me to see the subtle signs, the shift in weight, the tension in the shoulders, the direction of the eyes. He said that if you could read these things, you could be in the right place at the right time, every time." Lucas felt tears welling in his eyes as he watched his grandfather's teachings come to life through Steven Seagal's demonstration. Every principle from the journal, every story his grandfather had shared during quiet evenings, every lesson about wisdom and restraint was being validated before his eyes. "Your grandfather," Seagal said, turning to Lucas, "was a master of the invisible arts. He could end a fight before it started, not through intimidation or violence, but through understanding. He taught me that the greatest martial artist is the one who never has to prove he's a martial artist." The room remained silent, processing the profound shift in everything they thought they knew about strength, skill, and the true meaning of martial arts. In the span of 10 minutes, a quiet teenager with a leather journal had gone from being a figure of mockery to the keeper of a legacy that humbled them all. "William Hayes," Seagal said, his voice carrying clearly through the dojo, "was the finest warrior I've ever known, precisely because he understood that being a warrior meant choosing not to fight. He would be proud of you, Lucas, for carrying his memory forward with such dignity." And in that moment, with his grandfather's journal warm in his hands and Steven Seagal's words echoing in his heart, Lucas Hayes finally understood that the most powerful inheritance isn't money or property. It's the wisdom to know who you are and the courage to honor that knowledge, regardless of what others might think. The atmosphere in the dojo had shifted completely, like the moment when a storm breaks and the air pressure changes. Rourke stood in the center of the mat, his chest heaving from his failed attempts to land a single strike on Seagal, his face a mask of confusion and wounded pride. The trophies lining the walls seemed to gleam less brightly now, their golden surfaces reflecting a different kind of light. "I don't understand," Rourke said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "I've been training for 20 years. I've won regional championships. How can you just disappear like that?" Seagal's expression remained calm, but there was compassion in his eyes. "You've been training your body, and you've done it well. But William taught me that the body is only the beginning. The real art starts in the mind, in the spirit, in the part of you that sees beyond the physical." He gestured to the trophy cases. "These represent skill, dedication, achievement. But they also represent attachment to winning, to recognition, to the idea that your worth as a martial artist can be measured by external validation." Maya stepped forward, her black belt suddenly feeling heavy around her waist. "But isn't that what training is for? To get better, to win competitions, to advance in rank?" "Those things can be part of the journey," Seagal replied, "but they're not the destination. Your grandfather," he said, nodding to Lucas, "taught me that the highest rank is the one you give yourself when you choose compassion over conquest." Mr. Ito moved closer, his weathered face bright with understanding. "In Japan, we have a saying, 'The nail that sticks up gets hammered down.' But there is another way to interpret this. Sometimes the wisest course is to bend like the reed, not break like the oak." "Show us," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying more authority than anyone expected. The grandfather's journal was still clutched in his hands, but now it felt less like a shield and more like a torch. "Show us what he taught you." Seagal nodded, then turned to Rourke. "Are you willing to learn?" Rourke's jaw worked silently for a moment, his ego warring with his curiosity. The parents and students watched in tense silence as he struggled, with the implications of what he was being asked to do, to abandon his role as the unquestioned authority and become a student again. Yes, he said finally, the word coming out like a confession. Good. But first, you need to understand something fundamental. Everything you've learned about fighting stance, about aggressive positioning, about dominating space, forget it. For the next few minutes, think of yourself as water, not stone. Seagal moved to the center of the mat, his posture relaxed but alert. Attack me again, but this time, pay attention to what happens to your balance when I move. Rourke launched. Another combination, putting significant force behind his strikes. But this time, instead of simply evading, Seagal intercepted the attack with the gentlest touch imaginable. A fingertip pressed against Rourke's wrist, a slight redirection of his momentum. The result was startling. Rourke found himself stumbling forward, his own power working against him. Feel that? Seagal asked as he helped Rourke regain his balance. You generated all that force, but where did it go? I don't know. It just disappeared. It went exactly where you sent it, just not where you intended. William taught me that the most effective defense isn't blocking or countering. It's helping your opponent's attack go somewhere harmless. Several of the students gasped in amazement. This was unlike anything they'd seen in their tournaments or demonstrations. There was no flash, no dramatic technique, just a subtle redirection that rendered a powerful attack completely ineffective. Try it with me, Seagal said to Maya. Not to attack, but to understand. Maya approached hesitantly, her movements cautious. Seagal guided her through the basic principle, showing her how to feel the direction of incoming force and redirect it rather than oppose it. It's like catching a ball and throwing it back, but without the catching part, she said, wonder in her voice. Exactly. Your grandfather wrote about this principle extensively, Seagal said to Lucas. He called it aggressive gentleness, the idea that you could neutralize violence without adding to it. Lucas opened the journal to a page he'd studied the night before. True power flows like water around obstacles, not through them. The river always wins against the stone, not through force, but through persistence and wisdom. He was quoting Lao Tzu, Seagal explained, but he understood it on a level that most people never reach. He'd seen enough violence in his military service to know that adding more violence to a situation rarely improved it. Mr. Ito stepped forward, his eyes bright with recognition. This is Aiki, the principle of harmony. In traditional Japanese martial arts, we say that the highest level is to win without fighting. William preferred the term protective engagement, Seagal said. The idea that you could protect yourself and others without necessarily harming your attacker. He used to say that the best outcome of any confrontation was for everyone to walk away with their dignity intact. Rourke was listening intently now, his competitive instincts temporarily set aside. But how do you train for something like that? How do you measure progress if you're not winning matches or advancing in rank? You measure it by how many fights you don't have, Seagal replied. By how many conflicts you resolve without violence. By how many people you help rather than defeat. He gestured to the assembled students. Look at these young people. They've learned to punch, to kick, to grapple. But have they learned to de-escalate? To recognize when someone is acting out of fear rather than malice? To see the difference between a real threat and a wounded ego? The questions hung in the air like a challenge. Maya looked down at her black belt, suddenly seeing it differently. The parents exchanged glances, perhaps wondering if their children were learning the right lessons. Your grandfather, Seagal continued, addressing Lucas directly, believed that the ultimate goal of martial arts training was to create peacemakers, not warriors. People who were so confident in their abilities that they never needed to prove them. But what about self-defense? One of the parents asked. What about protecting your family? William taught me that the best self-defense is situational awareness, knowing when to avoid dangerous situations entirely. The second best is de-escalation, helping angry people calm down rather than escalating the conflict. Physical techniques are important, but they should be the last resort, not the first response. Lucas felt a profound shift in his understanding. All his life, he'd thought of himself as weak because he avoided confrontation, because he preferred talking to fighting, because he always looked for ways to defuse tension rather than increase it. But now he was beginning to see that these instincts weren't weaknesses, they were exactly what his grandfather had hoped to nurture in him. "Show us more," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Show us what real mastery looks like." Seagal smiled, and for the first time since he'd entered the dojo, his expression was one of pure joy. "Real mastery," he said, "is what happens when technique becomes so natural that it disappears, when wisdom becomes so integrated that it guides every action, when strength becomes so secure that it expresses itself as gentleness." He moved to the center of the mat again, but this time he didn't wait for an attack. Instead, he began to move through a series of techniques that flowed like a meditation, each movement connected to the next in an unbroken chain of purposeful motion. There was no aggression in his form, no display of power, just a demonstration of perfect balance and control. "This is what William called the dance of possibilities," he explained as he moved. "Every technique contains within it the seeds of peace or violence, depending on the intention of the practitioner. The choice is always yours." The students watched in mesmerized silence as Seagal's demonstration continued, each movement a lesson in the kind of martial arts that put wisdom before winning, understanding before domination, and service before self-aggrandizement. In that moment, Lucas realized that his grandfather's legacy wasn't just about fighting techniques or military service. It was about a completely different way of being strong in the world. And for the first time in his life, he felt proud to carry that legacy forward. The demonstration had ended, but its impact rippled through the dojo like aftershocks from an earthquake. Seagal stood quietly in the center of the mat, his breathing steady and calm, while around him the carefully constructed world of iron spirit martial arts began to crumble. Maya Lee was the first to move. She walked slowly toward the edge of the mat, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. The black belt around her waist, the symbol of 3 years of dedicated training, countless hours of practice, and hard-won victories in competition, suddenly felt like a costume she'd outgrown. "I don't think I've been learning martial arts at all," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been learning how to fight. There's a difference, isn't there?" Seagal nodded, his expression gentle but serious. "Fighting is about defeating others. Martial arts is about perfecting yourself. The two can overlap, but they're not the same thing." Maya's hands moved to her belt, her fingers working at the knot with trembling precision. "This belt, it represents everything I thought I wanted to be. But after seeing what you just showed us, I realize I don't even know what that is anymore." She loosened the belt and let it fall to the mat, the black fabric pooling at her feet like a shed skin. "I want to learn again, the right way this time." The gesture sent a shockwave through the assembled students and parents. Maya was their star pupil, their proof that the dojo's methods worked. Seeing her abandon her rank was like watching a cornerstone crumble. "Maya, what are you doing?" Rourke asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You've worked so hard for that belt. You've earned it." "Have I?" Maya's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I can break boards and win sparring matches, but I can't do what Mr. Seagal just did. I can't move like water around obstacles. I can't resolve conflicts without adding to them. What have I really earned?" Lucas stepped forward, his grandfather's journal still clutched in his hands. "You've earned the right to start over," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised everyone, including himself. "To learn what my grandfather tried to teach, that the strongest people are those who don't need to prove their strength." Mr. Ito moved toward Maya, his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. "In Japan, we have a ceremony called Hajimari, the beginning. Sometimes, to truly advance, we must return to the start and build again on a proper foundation." With deliberate ceremony, he began to untie his own belt. The brown fabric, worn and faded from years of use, joined Maya's on the mat. "Kenji, no," Rourke said, his voice cracking. "You're my assistant instructor. You can't just—" "I can," Mr. Ito said firmly. "I must. I came to America to share the traditional ways, but I allowed myself to be distracted by competitions and rankings. I forgot that the highest rank is the one you earn through service to others, not victories over them." One by one, other students began to approach the growing pile of belts. Some moved with certainty, others with hesitation, but all were driven. by the same recognition that something fundamental had changed in their understanding of what it meant to be a martial artist. "Stop," Rourke said, his voice rising to a shout. "All of you, stop. You're throwing away years of training, years of progress. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "We're choosing to begin again," said a quiet voice from the back of the room. Tommy Martinez, a 15-year-old brown belt who had never spoken up in class before, was walking toward the mat with his belt already in his hands. "We're choosing to learn from someone who taught Steven Seagal instead of someone who hits kids for telling the truth." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Several parents shifted uncomfortably, their phones now forgotten as they witnessed something that could never be captured in a simple video. Seagal's expression remained neutral, but his eyes found Rourke's face. "You struck this boy?" "He was being disrespectful," Rourke said, his voice defensive. "He was making up stories, trying to undermine my authority with fabricated claims about his grandfather." "His grandfather was William Hayes," Seagal said, his voice carrying a weight that made Rourke step back. "And even if he hadn't been, even if Lucas had been confused or mistaken, that would never justify violence against a student." Lucas felt his cheeks burning with the memory of yesterday's humiliation, but this time the heat was different. This time it was the warmth of vindication, of truth finally being acknowledged. "William taught me that a teacher's greatest responsibility is to protect the dignity of every student," Seagal continued. "He said that the moment you use your authority to humiliate rather than educate, you stop being a teacher and become a bully." Rourke's face went through a series of expressions: anger, denial, recognition, and finally, something approaching horror. I was protecting the integrity of the dojo. I couldn't let him spread false stories about military training. "They weren't false," Seagal said simply. "But even if they had been, your response was wrong." William would have listened, asked questions, found a way to honor the boy's intentions while gently correcting any misconceptions. That's what real teachers do. The pile of belts on the mat had grown to include nearly half the students in the class. The trophy cases that had once been Rourke's pride now seemed to loom over the room like monuments to misplaced priorities. "I built this place," Rourke said, his voice breaking. "I dedicated my life to martial arts. I helped these students achieve things they never thought possible." "You helped them achieve trophies," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. "But did you help them achieve wisdom? Did you help them become better people?" Seagal placed Lucas's grandfather's journal on a small table near the front of the dojo, opening it to a page that seemed to glow in the fluorescent light. "William wrote something about this," he said, "about the difference between building students up and building yourself up through your students." He read aloud. "A true teacher plants seeds in gardens he will never see. His greatest satisfaction comes not from the recognition of his skill, but from the knowledge that his students have surpassed him in wisdom and compassion. The master who needs his students to validate his greatness has not yet learned the first lesson of leadership." The words hit Rourke like physical blows. He staggered backward, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. Around him, the dojo that had been his kingdom was transforming into something entirely different, a place where belts and trophies meant less than character and understanding. "I don't know how to teach like that," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to be that kind of teacher." "Then learn," Seagal said, his voice gentle but firm. "William always said that the best students eventually become teachers, and the best teachers never stop being students. You have knowledge and skill, those are gifts. But you need to learn how to use them in service of others, not in service of your own ego." Maya looked up from the pile of belts, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes bright with possibility. "Could you teach us? Could you show us how to start over?" Seagal was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face around the room. "I can share what William taught me," he said finally. "But the real teaching will come from within. Yourselves, from your commitment to growth and service." He gestured to the journal. "Everything you need to know is in there, in William's words and wisdom. Lucas has inherited more than just a book. He's inherited a responsibility to carry forward a tradition of martial arts that puts humanity first." Lucas felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. the knowledge that his grandfather's legacy was now his to protect and share. "We'll need to start from the beginning," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "All of us. No ranks, no trophies, no competitions. Just the desire to learn and grow and become better people. Just like your grandfather would have wanted," Seagal said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. As the sun set outside the strip mall, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Iron Spirit Martial Arts Dojo was reborn. Not as a place of competition and ego, but as a sanctuary for those seeking to understand the true meaning of strength. The pile of discarded belts on the mat would remain there for days, a powerful symbol of the courage it takes to begin again, to choose wisdom over winning, and to honor the legacy of a quiet man who had trained warriors to be something more than fighters. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the dojo, casting long golden rectangles across the polished floor. But the space itself had been transformed overnight, not through any dramatic renovation, but through a fundamental shift in purpose and energy. The trophy cases had been moved to a storage room, replaced by a simple wooden table bearing William Hay's photograph and his leather journal. Lucas arrived early, Jasper trotting beside him with his usual loyalty. The old dog had adapted to the new routine with the easy acceptance of an animal who understood that love and consistency mattered more than location. As Lucas unlocked the door, he felt his grandfather's presence strongly, as if the old man were walking beside him into this new chapter. Steven Seagal was already inside, sitting in quiet meditation on a simple cushion near the center of the mat. He opened his eyes as Lucas entered, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Your grandfather always said that the best training began before the sun was fully up," Seagal said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades learning to lead without dominating. He believed that the quiet hours held the most potential for growth. "I've been reading his journal every morning," Lucas replied, settling cross-legged on the mat beside Seagal. "There's so much I never knew about him, so much wisdom I'm still trying to understand." "Understanding comes through practice," Seagal said. "William didn't just write about these principles, he lived them. And now it's your turn to discover what that means." Other students began arriving as the morning progressed. Maya came first, her movements more relaxed than they'd been in months. Without the pressure of maintaining her rank and reputation, she seemed to have rediscovered the joy that had originally drawn her to martial arts. Mr. Ito arrived next, carrying a small box of traditional Japanese incense. "For the memorial," he explained, lighting several sticks and placing them near William's photograph. "In my country, we honor our teachers by carrying their wisdom forward." Even Rourke came, his face showing the strain of a man grappling with the complete reconstruction of his worldview. He moved hesitantly, unsure of his place in this new dynamic, but committed to learning what he had missed during his years of chasing external validation. "Today we begin with the fundamentals," Seagal announced as the group gathered in a circle around William's journal. "Not the fundamentals of fighting, but the fundamentals of being. Position before submission, balance before strength, understanding before action." He gestured to Mr. Ito, who stepped forward with the natural grace of someone returning to long-abandoned principles. "In traditional martial arts, we say that the student's first teacher is the earth beneath their feet. Before you can move others, you must understand how to move yourself." The lesson that followed was unlike anything the dojo had ever experienced. Instead of rigid formations and synchronized movements, the students explored natural stances, learning to feel the connection between their bodies and the ground that supported them. Instead of practicing strikes and blocks, they practiced breathing, meditation, and the subtle art of presence. "Your grandfather wrote about this extensively," Seagal said, opening the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He called it foundational awareness, the understanding that all effective action begins with stillness and observation. Lucas read aloud from the journal. "The warrior who rushes into battle without first understanding the terrain is not brave, he is foolish." The same principle applies to any conflict. Before you can resolve a situation, you must first understand what you are truly dealing with. "But how do you develop that understanding?" Maya asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the competitive edge that had once defined her questions. "Through practice," Seagal replied. through learning to see beneath the surface of things. William taught me that most conflicts are not about what they appear to be about. People fight over parking spaces when they're really fighting about respect. Children rebel against authority when they're really seeking guidance. Understanding the deeper currents allows you to address the real issues. He demonstrated by working with two students who were asked to role-play a simple disagreement. Instead of teaching them to defend their positions or defeat their opponents, he showed them how to listen for the underlying needs and concerns that were driving the conflict. This is what William called aggressive listening, Seagal explained. You engage with the same intensity that you would bring to physical combat, but you're fighting for understanding rather than victory. The morning session continued with exercises that challenged the students to expand their definition of martial arts. They practiced moving through space with awareness of everyone around them, learning to sense tension and intention without relying on visual cues. They explored the subtle art of de-escalation, discovering how tone of voice and body language could either inflame or defuse a situation. I feel like I'm learning to see for the first time, Maya said during a break, her face flushed with the excitement of discovery. All these years, I thought I was becoming more skilled, but I was really just becoming more narrow. That's the beginning of wisdom, Mr. Ito said, his eyes bright with the joy of someone who had found his way back to a long-lost path. In Zen, we say that the expert's mind has many limitations, but the beginner's mind has infinite possibilities. Lucas found himself naturally taking on a teaching role, sharing insights from his grandfather's journal and helping other students navigate the unfamiliar territory of internal development. It was a strange sensation. For years he had been the quiet observer, the one who watched from the sidelines. Now he was being asked to step forward and guide others. Your grandfather would be proud, Seagal said during a quiet moment when the two of them were alone. He always said that the best way to honor a teacher is to become a teacher yourself, to pass on the wisdom you've received. I'm not sure I'm ready for that responsibility, Lucas admitted. William wrote something about readiness, Seagal said, opening the journal to a familiar page. He said that readiness is not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to seek them with humility and dedication. As the morning session drew to a close, the students gathered once more around the journal. The incense Mr. Ito had lit earlier still carried its gentle fragrance through the air, creating an atmosphere of reverence and possibility. Tomorrow we will continue, Seagal announced. But remember, the real training happens in the spaces between our formal practice. It happens in how you treat the person who cuts you off in traffic, how you respond to criticism, how you choose to handle disappointment and frustration. Lucas closed his grandfather's journal with the same reverence he had seen his grandfather use during those quiet evenings years ago. He always said that the dojo was just the beginning, he said. The real test of a martial artist is how they live their life when no one is watching. And that, Seagal said with a smile, is the lesson that takes a lifetime to master. As the students filed out of the dojo, their movements more relaxed and centered than they had been in months, Lucas remained behind with Jasper. The old dog settled beside William's photograph, his presence a living link to the man whose legacy was now blooming in ways he could never have imagined. Outside, the Nevada sun was climbing toward its zenith, promising another day of desert heat and endless possibilities. But inside the dojo, something cooler and more sustainable was taking root, the kind of growth that comes not from competition or recognition, but from the simple commitment to becoming worthy of the wisdom you've inherited. The Iron Spirit. Martial Arts Dojo was being reborn, one breath at a time, one student at a time, one lesson at a time. And at the center of it all was the quiet legacy of a man who had taught warriors to be something more than fighters, and who had trusted his grandson to carry that legacy forward into a world that desperately needed to remember the difference between strength and power, between winning and wisdom, between fighting and understanding. The real training was just beginning. The afternoon heat outside the dojo was brutal, but inside the transformed space, a different kind of energy was building. The formal training session had ended hours ago, but students lingered, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Conversations that would have once focused on tournament schedules and ranking requirements, now centered on philosophy, on the deeper meanings behind the techniques they were learning to unlearn. Lucas sat cross-legged beside his grandfather's photograph, the leather journal open in his lap as he read quietly to a small group gathered. Around him, Maya lay on her stomach nearby, her chin propped on her hands as she listened with the rapt attention of someone discovering a new language. Mr. Ito moved quietly through the space, adjusting the lighting and ensuring everyone was comfortable, his movements carrying the natural grace of someone who had rediscovered his purpose. "Listen to this," Lucas said, his voice carrying clearly through the dojo. The student asked his master why he spent so much time teaching defense and so little time teaching attack. The master replied, "Because I am not training you to be dangerous to others. I am training you to be dangerous to your own limitations." "That's beautiful," Maya whispered. "I spent 3 years learning to be dangerous to other people. I never even considered being dangerous to my own fears." Steven Seagal, who had been sitting in quiet meditation near the back of the room, opened his eyes and smiled. "Your grandfather had a gift for distilling complex truths into simple statements. He used to say that the best teachers were translators, helping students understand concepts that seemed impossibly foreign." Sensei Rourke approached the group hesitantly, his movements careful and uncertain. The confident swagger that had once defined his presence was gone, replaced by something more humble and infinitely more genuine. He carried a folding chair, setting it down at the edge of the circle without presuming to join the intimate gathering. "May I listen?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas looked up from the journal, studying the man who had humiliated him just days before. The anger was gone, replaced by something deeper and more complex, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. He gestured to a spot on the mat beside him. "Grandpa always said that the most important lessons were learned in circles, not hierarchies." Lucas said, "Everyone sits on the same level." Rourke's eyes filled with tears as he abandoned the chair and lowered himself to the mat. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice breaking. "Not just for hitting you, but for everything that led up to that moment. For not listening, for not respecting your grandfather's memory, for letting my ego make me cruel." The dojo fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Lucas felt the weight of the moment, the opportunity to either heal or inflict further wounds. His grandfather's compass seemed to pulse in his pocket, pointing him toward his true north. "You hurt me," Lucas said simply, "but you also taught me something important about the difference between power and authority. Real authority comes from wisdom and service, not from the ability to intimidate others." "Your grandfather wrote about that too," Seagal added, reaching for the journal. "Here, the leader who must constantly remind others of his position has already lost it. True leadership is like the wind. You feel its effects everywhere, but you can never point to its exact location." Rourke wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I built this place to prove something to my father, to show him that I could be successful in martial arts. But I realize now that I was just recreating the same harsh, competitive environment that had wounded me as a child." "That's the beginning of wisdom," Mr. Ito said gently. "Recognizing the patterns that have shaped us gives us the power to choose different patterns for the future." Maya sat up, her expression thoughtful. "I think I did the same thing. I was so focused on being the best student, on earning recognition, that I forgot why I started training in the first place. I just wanted to feel strong, to feel like I belonged somewhere." "You do belong somewhere," Lucas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority he was beginning to recognize as his inheritance. "You belong here, with all of us, learning together. But now you're learning to be strong in a different way." The conversation continued as the afternoon shadows lengthened, each person sharing their own journey of discovery. Parents who had initially come to pick up their children found themselves drawn into the discussions, their own preconceptions about martial arts and strength being gently challenged. Angela Hayes arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, her work uniform wrinkled from a long day at the diner. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, her son at the center of a learning circle, his grandfather's journal open between them, faces turned toward him with the kind of respect that couldn't be demanded or earned through competition. "Mom," Lucas called out, gesturing for her to join them. "Come listen to what Grandpa wrote about family legacy." Angela settled onto the mat beside her son, her presence adding another layer of warmth to the gathering. Lucas turned to a page near the back of the journal, his voice taking on the reverent tone he used for his grandfather's most profound insights. A man's true legacy is not measured in the monuments built in his honor, but in the number of people who carry his values forward after he is gone. The greatest inheritance I can leave my family is not money or property, but the understanding that strength serves others, that wisdom seeks peace, and that the most courageous act is often the decision not to fight. The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Lucas felt his grandfather's presence more strongly than he had since the old man's funeral. But this time, the presence wasn't tinged with grief. It was filled with purpose and possibility. "Tomorrow," Seagal said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades learning to lead without dominating, "we begin the real work. Not learning techniques or memorizing forms, but discovering who we are when we strip away everything that doesn't serve our highest purpose. Will you stay to help us?" Maya asked, her voice carrying both hope and understanding that his presence was a gift, not a given. Seagal smiled, his eyes moving from face to face around the circle. "For a few more days. But remember, the teacher you really need is already here." His gaze settled on Lucas, who felt both the weight and the joy of his grandfather's legacy settling more comfortably on his shoulders. As the gathering began to disperse, each person carrying with them a piece of the wisdom they had shared, Lucas remained on the mat with his grandfather's journal. The dojo was quiet now except for the gentle breathing of Jasper, who had spent the entire afternoon sleeping peacefully beside William's photograph. "We did it, Grandpa," Lucas whispered, his hand resting on the worn leather cover of the journal. "We're building something worthy of what you taught us." Outside, the Nevada desert was preparing for another night, the temperature dropping with the setting sun. But inside the dojo, something warm and sustainable was taking root, the kind of growth that comes not from external validation, but from the simple commitment to becoming worthy of the wisdom you've inherited. The transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Steven Seagal's departure, and the Iron Spirit martial arts dojo had settled into a rhythm that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known it in its previous incarnation. The evening class was small. Only 8 students remained from the original group, but their dedication ran deeper than any rank or tournament schedule could measure. Lucas knelt beside his grandfather's memorial table, lighting the incense. That had become part of their daily ritual. The photograph of William Hayes seemed to watch over the proceedings with quiet approval, and the leather journal lay open to a page that had become their evening reading tradition. "Before we begin moving," Lucas said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had grown into his role as keeper of his grandfather's legacy, "let's remember why we're here." The students, Maya, Mr. Ito, Rourke, Tommy Martinez, and 3 others who had chosen to stay and rebuild rather than seek easier paths, sat in a loose circle on the mat. There were no belts around their waists, no ranks to maintain, no competitions to prepare for. Just 8 people committed to understanding what it meant to be strong in service of something greater than themselves. "Grandpa wrote this 3 days before he died," Lucas continued, his finger tracing the familiar handwriting. "I have spent my life teaching warriors to be peacemakers, showing strong people how to use their strength gently. Tonight, I realized that the most important lesson cannot be taught, it can only be lived. Each person must discover for themselves what it means to bow not in submission, but in recognition of the divine spark that exists in every human being." Maya closed her eyes, feeling the words settle into her heart like seeds finding fertile ground. "I never understood what bowing really meant before," she said. "I thought it was about showing respect to higher ranks, acknowledging superiority. But it's really about recognizing the humanity in everyone, isn't it? Including ourselves," Mr. Ito added, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent months rediscovering principles he had carried as a young man in Japan. "The hardest person to bow to is often the one in the mirror." Rourke nodded, his face showing the deep lines that had appeared as he'd worked to rebuild his understanding of what it meant to teach. "I spent so many years demanding respect without earning it, commanding bows without understanding their meaning. I'm still learning how to deserve the trust these students place in me." "You're earning it every day," Lucas said, and meant it. The transformation in Rourke had been profound. Not dramatic or sudden, but steady and genuine. He still taught technique and form, but now those lessons were woven into discussions of character, integrity, and service. Should we begin with sitting meditation? Tommy asked. The 15-year-old had blossomed in the new environment, his natural thoughtfulness finally finding expression in a space that valued reflection over aggression. Lucas nodded, and the group settled into the comfortable silence that had become their foundation. Outside, the strip mall was busy with evening shoppers, the sounds of car doors and conversations filtering through the windows. But inside the dojo, a different kind of awareness was cultivating itself. After 10 minutes of silent breathing, they began to move. Not through rigid forms or competitive drills, but through the flowing exercises that Seagal had taught them, movements that emphasized balance, harmony, and the seamless integration of physical and mental discipline. Remember, Lucas said as they practiced gentle redirections and subtle balance shifts, we're not learning to fight. We're learning to flow around conflict like water around stones. Angela Hayes slipped in quietly, as she did most evenings after her shift at the diner. She had become the unofficial guardian of the group, providing snacks, first aid when needed, and the kind of maternal presence that reminded everyone they were part of something larger than themselves. Jasper raised his graying head from his favorite spot beside the memorial table, his tail offering a brief wag of recognition before he settled back into his watchful rest. The old dog had become something of a mascot for the group, his presence a living reminder of loyalty, patience, and the kind of love that asks nothing in return. I have something to share, Maya said during their closing circle, her voice carrying a note of excitement that had become familiar. Each week, one of the students would share how they had applied their training to real-life situations, not through physical confrontation, but through the deeper principles they were learning. I was at work yesterday, she continued. Maya had taken a part-time job at a local community center, helping with after-school programs. There was a situation with two kids who were about to get into a fight. Instead of just separating them or sending them to the office, I remembered what Mr. Seagal taught us about listening for the real conflict. What did you find? Lucas asked, genuinely curious. The fight wasn't about the basketball they were arguing over. One of the kids had been dealing with his parents' divorce, and the other was frustrated because he felt ignored by the coaches. Once I helped them recognize what was really bothering them, they ended up helping each other instead of fighting. Mr. Ito smiled, his eyes bright with pride. This is what we call practical wisdom, taking the principles from the mat and applying them to daily life. Your grandfather would call it aggressive compassion, Rourke added, referencing one of William's favorite phrases. Using the same intensity you would bring to physical combat, but directing it toward understanding and healing instead of defeating. Lucas felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with watching his grandfather's wisdom take root in new lives. Each story like Maya's was a validation that they were on the right path, that the principles they were cultivating could make a real difference in the world. I think it's time for the closing reading, he said, opening the journal to the final entry his grandfather had made. Today I watched my grandson help an injured bird, spending an hour of his afternoon ensuring it was safe and comfortable before releasing it back to its family. In that moment, I saw everything I had hoped to teach him about strength, gentleness, and the warrior's true purpose. He did not need to prove his power or demonstrate his skill. He simply saw a need and responded with compassion. This is the highest form of martial arts, the cultivation of a heart that serves others without counting the cost. The words settled over the group like a blessing, and Lucas felt his grandfather's presence so strongly that he almost turned to look for him. But instead of grief or longing, he felt only gratitude for the legacy he had inherited, for the friends who had chosen to walk this path with him, for the opportunity to honor his grandfather's memory by living his values. The most important bow, he said, closing the journal with the reverence of someone handling sacred text, is the one we make in our hearts when we choose to serve something greater than ourselves. One by one, the students bowed, not to Lucas or to any rank or authority, but to the wisdom they were all learning to embody, to the legacy they were all helping to carry forward, and to the possibility that strength could be a gift offered in service rather than a weapon wielded in conquest. As the evening light faded outside the strip mall and the dojo settled into peaceful quiet, Jasper stretched and ambled over to his favorite sleeping spot. Angela began turning off lights, her movements efficient and loving. The students gathered their belongings and made plans for tomorrow's training, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of people who had found their tribe. Lucas remained on the mat for a few extra minutes, his grandfather's journal in his hands and his heart full of purpose. The compass in his pocket pointed steadily north, just as it always had. But now he understood that true north wasn't a direction, it was a choice. The choice to honor the wisdom you've inherited, to serve others with the strength you've been given, and to bow deeply enough to recognize the sacred in the ordinary. The Iron Spirit Martial Arts Dojo had been reborn, transformed from a place of competition and ego into a sanctuary for those seeking to understand the true meaning of strength. And at the center of it all was the quiet legacy of a man who had taught warriors to be something more than fighters, and who had trusted his grandson to carry that legacy forward into a world that desperately needed to remember the difference between power and purpose. The true bow had been made, and the real training would continue for as long as there were hearts willing to learn that the greatest victories are indeed won without throwing a single punch. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.